Congratulations, Mom. Now you can live your dream of being a farmer. The laughter that followed those words felt like knives cutting through my chest. My own son, my only child, was mocking me in front of everyone while I sat there clutching the deed to what looked like the most worthless piece of land in Wisconsin. But David had no idea that his cruel joke had just handed me the key to a treasure his great-grandfather had hidden for over 80 years. I'm Margaret Goldstein, and I'm 69 years old, sitting here in what used to be my son's $1 million Chicago penthouse, the same penthouse he thought would never be mine. 3 years ago, I was the laughingstock of our synagogue, the woman whose son made her live on a broken-down farm while he lived like a king off his inheritance. Today, I own that penthouse, his rental properties, and a $4.2 million wine collection that came from the most unlikely place you could imagine. You see, my husband Benjamin died suddenly last spring, and I thought our $3.6 million real estate empire would be split between David and me. Instead, David inherited $2.8 million worth of profitable Chicago rental properties while I got Samuel's old farm in Wisconsin, 160 acres of overgrown fields, a collapsing barn, and a farmhouse that hadn't been touched since 1940. Dad must have thought you wanted to raise chickens at your age, David continued, while his wife Jessica giggled and the lawyer looked uncomfortable. Maybe you can start a petting zoo for the local kids. Everyone in that room, family members, witnesses, people who had known me for decades, they all looked away. Nobody defended me. Nobody stood up for the woman who had helped build the very fortune my son was now celebrating. I walked out of that office feeling like my life was over. I was 69 years old, recently widowed, and apparently the owner of a piece of property that even my own son considered a joke. What I didn't know was that behind the crumbling walls of that worthless farmhouse lay a secret that would turn my world upside down and teach my son the most expensive lesson of his life. Tell me in the comments what you're doing while you listen to my story. Are you folding laundry, having your morning coffee, or maybe just taking a quiet moment for yourself? Hit that like button, because each like helps my voice reach other women who might be facing their own family betrayals. And subscribe to Grandma's Legacy, because no grandmother should ever face this kind of cruelty alone. But before I tell you about the treasure I found, you need to understand how we got to that horrible day in the lawyer's office. You need to know about the love story that built our family's fortune, and about the sweet little boy who somehow turned into a man who could laugh at his own mother's pain. Looking back now from this beautiful penthouse where I sip wine worth more per bottle than most people make in a month, I can see that the farm wasn't punishment. It was the greatest gift Benjamin could have given me. To understand how we ended up in that lawyer's office with my son treating me like garbage, I need to take you back to 1972, when I was 25 years old and working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Chicago's Rogers Park neighborhood. That's where I met Benjamin Goldstein, a 28-year-old with gentle eyes and calloused hands who was trying to expand his father Samuel's small real estate business. Ben came to our firm because he needed help organizing the financial records that Samuel kept in shoeboxes and coffee cans, old country habits from a man who had learned not to trust banks with everything he owned. "Miss Margaret," Ben said in his soft voice during our first meeting, "I know my father's system looks like chaos, but there's method to his madness. He survived things most people can't imagine, and he's built something good from nothing. I just need help making it look professional so we can grow." I fell in love with Ben's respect for his father and his dreams of building something lasting. Samuel Goldstein had fled Nazi Germany in 1938 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a few family treasures he'd managed to hide. He'd worked 18-hour days as a janitor, saved every penny, and slowly bought rundown buildings that nobody else wanted in Chicago, neighborhoods that seemed hopeless at the time. Ben and I married in 1974 in a small ceremony at Temple Beth Shalom. Samuel walked me down the aisle because my own father had passed the year before, and I remember the tears in his eyes as he placed my hand in his son's. "In Europe, I lost everything," Samuel whispered to me during the reception, his accent still thick after 36 years in America. "But now I see my son has found everything. You will build something beautiful together." Samuel was right. Ben and I became true partners in every sense of the word. While he handled the property acquisitions and renovations, I managed the books, dealt with tenants, and gradually modernized the business practices that Samuel had cobbled together through pure survival instinct. The 1970s and 1980s were hard work, but good years. We bought buildings in neighborhoods that other investors avoided, areas with large immigrant populations, working-class families, people who reminded Ben of his own father's struggles. We kept rents fair, maintained properties well, and slowly built a reputation as landlords who cared about their tenants' lives, not just their rent payments. David was born in 1982, and for the first few years, he was the light of our lives. Ben would carry him around construction sites in a little hard hat, teaching him about plumbing and electrical work, and the satisfaction of fixing things with your own hands. I have pictures of 3-year-old David helping his grandfather Samuel plant tomatoes in the garden behind our small house on Kedzie Avenue. "This boy will be smart like his mother and strong like his father," Samuel would say, bouncing David on his knee. "And maybe he'll appreciate the things we've built for him." But even then, there were warning signs I chose to ignore. By the time David started school in the late 1980s, our business had grown significantly. We owned 12 buildings spread across 3 neighborhoods, providing steady income from over 150 rental units. We weren't wealthy by Chicago standards, but we were comfortable, and more importantly, we were building something that would last. Samuel lived with us until David was 10, sharing stories about the old country and teaching his grandson chess on winter evenings. David loved those chess games, and Samuel was patient with his questions about everything from business to history to life in Europe before the war. But I noticed that David's questions were increasingly about money rather than family history. "How much is our building on Ashland worth, Grandpa?" he'd ask. "Are we richer than the Cohens down the street? Why don't we live in a bigger house if we own so many buildings?" Samuel would try to redirect those conversations toward values and hard work, but David's focus always returned to wealth and status. By middle school, he was embarrassed when Ben picked him up from school in our practical Honda instead of the luxury cars his classmates' parents drove. "Dad, everyone thinks we're poor," David complained when he was 12. "Why can't we buy a nice car and live in Lincoln Park like normal rich people?" Ben tried to explain that wealth wasn't about showing off, but about building security and helping others. "Son, every building we buy provides homes for families who need them. Every dollar we save is protection for our future. Grandpa Samuel taught me that you can lose everything overnight, so you build slowly and you build smart." But David didn't want to hear about building slowly. He wanted the instant gratification and obvious success symbols that his friends took for granted. When Samuel passed away in 1995, David was 13 and more interested in video games than family history. Samuel left his personal possessions to David: old photograph albums, his chess set, some jewelry that had belonged to David's great-grandmother, and the deed to the Wisconsin farm that nobody had visited in years. "Why did Grandpa leave me this old junk?" David asked, barely glancing at the photographs of relatives who had died in the Holocaust. "And what am I supposed to do with some farm in the middle of nowhere?" I tried to explain the significance of those photographs, the stories Samuel had told about his parents and siblings who hadn't escaped Germany, the sacrifices that had been made so that David could grow up safe and free in America. But David just shrugged and stuffed everything into a box that went into the basement. "That's ancient history, Mom. It doesn't have anything to do with my life." The high school years were when David's personality really changed. He was smart, brilliant actually, but he used his intelligence to find shortcuts rather than to build character. He cheated on tests when he thought he could get away with it. He lied about his activities when the truth was inconvenient. He began to see his parents as obstacles to the lifestyle he believed he deserved. "Why do you guys live like immigrants?" he'd ask with disgust. "We have money. Why don't we spend it?" Ben and I tried different approaches. We sent David to Hebrew school, hoping religious education might help him develop some perspective. We involved him in charitable work through our synagogue, thinking that seeing people less fortunate might teach him gratitude. But David was learning different lessons from his peers at the expensive private school we'd enrolled him in. He learned that money was for spending, not saving. He learned that success was measured by what you owned, not what you built. He learned that image mattered more than substance. When David graduated from high school and announced he wanted to study finance at Northwestern, Ben was cautiously optimistic. "Maybe if he understands how money really works, he'll appreciate what we've built," Ben told me. "Maybe he'll want to take over the business someday." But college only made David's attitudes worse. He studied investment strategies and market speculation while dismissing real estate as boring and old-fashioned. He came home for holidays talking about hedge funds and cryptocurrency, rolling his eyes when Ben tried to discuss the fundamentals of property management. "Dad, you guys are thinking small," David would say with the arrogance that only a college junior can muster. "You're sitting on millions of dollars in assets that could be leveraged for real wealth. You could sell everything, invest in growth stocks, and triple your money in 5 years. And what happens if the market crashes?" Ben would ask quietly. "Then you diversify. You hedge your bets. You don't put all your money in old buildings that need constant maintenance." These conversations always ended the same way, with Ben looking sad and David looking frustrated. My husband had learned from his father that slow, steady building was the path to real security. David had learned from his professors that aggressive growth was the path to real wealth. By the time David graduated and started working for a Chicago investment firm in 2004, the gap between father and son had become a canyon. David made more money in his first year as a financial advisor than Ben and I had made in our first 5 years of marriage, and he never let us forget it. "I made $40,000 in commissions last month," David would brag during Sunday dinners. "That's more than you guys probably clear from all your buildings combined." It wasn't true. Our properties generated substantial monthly income. But David didn't understand the difference between flashy commissions and steady cash flow. He saw only the immediate gratification of a big paycheck, not the long-term security of assets that appreciated over time. When David married Jessica in 2008, I hoped that love might soften some of his harder edges. Jessica came from a wealthy family. Her father owned a successful construction company, and she was beautiful, educated, and charming when she wanted to be. But Jessica reinforced David's worst tendencies instead of moderating them. She encouraged his spending, supported his criticisms of our outdated lifestyle, and made it clear that she expected David to provide the kind of luxurious life her parents had given her. "David's so talented," she would tell anyone who would listen. "He's going to be incredibly successful once he starts managing real money instead of just those little apartment buildings." Those little apartment buildings were supporting 3 families and providing steady income that had weathered every economic downturn since the 1970s. But to Jessica, they were embarrassing reminders that her in-laws weren't as sophisticated as her own parents. The real turning point came in 2010, when David approached Ben about borrowing money to invest in what he called sure thing opportunities. "Dad, I've got clients who are making incredible returns in commercial development. If you let me leverage some of the building equity, we could double the family's net worth in 2 years. Ben's answer was firm and final. "Son, these buildings aren't gambling chips. They're homes for people who depend on us. They're security for our family's future. I won't risk that for any investment scheme." David's reaction was to stop visiting us regularly and to start treating family gatherings like business meetings, where he tried to convince Ben to modernize his approach to wealth management. By 2015, David and Jessica had bought their own condo in Lincoln Park, joined an exclusive country club, and essentially created a life that had no room for parents who lived modestly and worked with their hands. "We're just not on the same wavelength anymore," David told me when I asked why we saw him so rarely. "You and Dad are satisfied with small-time stuff, but Jessica and I have bigger goals." The final years before Ben's death were marked by David's increasing condescension toward the life his parents had built. He would visit on holidays, critique our outdated decorating, suggest that we were wasting money on building maintenance, and generally make it clear that he considered himself far more sophisticated than the people who had raised him. Ben never stopped loving his son, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes when David would check his phone during conversations or cut visits short to attend networking events that were more important than spending time with family. "I don't know where we went wrong, Margaret," Ben told me one night in early 2023, just a few months before his heart attack. "I wanted to give him opportunities I never had, but somewhere along the way, he stopped caring about the things that actually matter." I should have paid more attention to the sadness in Ben's voice. I should have realized that my husband was making plans for a future he sensed might not include him for much longer. But I was focused on the day-to-day challenges of managing our properties and maintaining our marriage, not on the legal documents Ben was quietly updating or the conversations he was having with lawyers about protecting the legacy his father had started with nothing but determination and hope. I thought David would grow out of his selfishness. I thought that love and time would eventually bring our family back together. I was wrong about David, but I was also wrong about Ben's final gift to both of us. The signs that something was seriously wrong with David's character became impossible to ignore after Ben's funeral in March 2023. While I was still in shock from losing my husband of 49 years to a sudden heart attack, David was already making phone calls about expediting the probate process and asking pointed questions about the family's financial situation. "Mom, we need to talk about getting Dad's affairs in order," he said 3 days after we buried Ben, while I was still finding his reading glasses around the house and crying every time I opened the refrigerator to see his favorite yogurt. "David, can we please wait a few weeks? I'm not ready to deal with business right now." "But that's exactly why we need to deal with it now, while you're not thinking clearly. Dad's estate needs professional management, and you're going to need help making rational decisions about the properties." The way he said, "not thinking clearly," should have been my first warning. David had already decided that grief made me incompetent and that he was the only one qualified to handle our family's financial future. Over the next few weeks, while I was trying to figure out how to live without the partner who had shared every major decision with me for nearly 5 decades, David was researching property values, meeting with real estate agents, and consulting with tax attorneys about optimizing the inheritance structure. "Mom, you need to understand that Dad's way of doing business died with him," David announced during one particularly painful conversation. "These buildings are worth a lot more than you realize, but they're also a huge liability. Property management is a young person's game, and you're almost 70 years old." I tried to explain that I had been co-managing those properties for decades, that I knew every tenant and every building's quirks, that the business ran smoothly because Ben and I had systems in place that David didn't understand. But David had made up his mind that I was a helpless widow who needed his protection from my own poor judgment. The situation got worse when Jessica got involved. She would come to our family meetings with spreadsheets and market analyses, talking about the incredible opportunity to liquidate Dad's old-fashioned portfolio and invest in growth-oriented assets. "Margaret, you have to think about your future," Jessica would say with fake sympathy. "David's trying to help you maximize your inheritance so you can retire comfortably. But if you insist on holding on to these old buildings, you'll be working until you die." What they didn't understand, or didn't care to understand, was that managing those properties wasn't work for me, it was purpose. Those buildings represented Ben's and my life together. The tenants weren't just income sources, they were people I'd known for years, families I'd helped through difficult times, elderly people who counted on me to keep their homes safe and affordable. But to David and Jessica, I was just an obstacle to efficient wealth management. The breaking point came in early April, when David arrived at my house unannounced with a real estate agent and a property appraiser. "Mom, I've set up some consultations so we can get realistic assessments of what we're dealing with," he said, letting himself in with the key I'd given him for emergencies. "David, I didn't agree to any consultations. I'm not ready to make decisions about selling anything." "That's exactly the problem, Mom. You're letting emotions cloud your business judgment. Dad would want us to be smart about this." The appraiser spent 3 hours going through our house. The home where Ben and I had raised David, where we'd celebrated holidays and anniversaries, where we'd built a life together. He measured rooms, took photographs, and calculated square footage while David followed him around, discussing market comps and optimal pricing strategies. I sat in the kitchen, feeling like a stranger in my own home, watching my son treat our family's legacy like a commodity to be evaluated and sold. That evening, after the appraiser left, David presented me with what he called some preliminary numbers. "Mom, this house alone is worth $680,000 in today's market. The 12 rental properties are conservatively valued at $2.1 million total. Dad's investment accounts have about $400,000. We're looking at a $318 million estate." Those numbers should have made me feel secure, but the way David said "we" made my stomach turn. This wasn't a conversation about my financial future. It was a presentation about his inheritance expectations. "David, your father and I built this together over 50 years. I'm not ready to sell everything just because some appraiser thinks that's the smart move." "Mom, you're not being rational. You can't manage 12 buildings by yourself. You're going to make mistakes, lose money, maybe even get sued if something goes wrong. The responsible thing is to liquidate the portfolio while the market is good and invest the proceeds professionally." "And who's going to handle this professional investing?" David's smile was answer enough. He'd already planned out my entire financial future, with himself as the manager of the wealth that Ben and I had spent decades accumulating. That night, I called Ben's lawyer, Harold Weinstein, who had been handling our family's legal affairs for over 20 years. "Harold, I need to understand exactly what Ben's will says. David is pressuring me to sell everything, and I want to know what my options are." Harold's voice was gentle but firm. "Margaret, I think you should come to my office tomorrow. There are things about Ben's final arrangements that we need to discuss privately." The next morning, I sat in Harold's office feeling nervous and confused. Ben and I had always made major decisions together, but apparently, he'd made some final decisions without me. "Margaret, Ben came to see me several times over the past year," Harold began. "He was worried about David's attitude toward money and his lack of respect for the business you'd built together. Ben specifically asked me to structure his will in a way that would protect your interests and hopefully teach David some important lessons." Harold opened a thick folder and pulled out documents I'd never seen before. Ben left the house and most of the rental properties to David, along with the investment accounts. That comes to about $2.8 million in assets. My heart sank. I'd expected to inherit at least half of what we'd built together. "But," Harold continued, "Ben also left you several specific bequests that David doesn't know about. Most importantly, he left you the Wisconsin farm that belonged to his father, Samuel." I stared at Harold in confusion. "The farm? Harold, that property has been abandoned for decades. There's nothing there but an old farmhouse and some overgrown fields." That's what Ben wanted David to think. But Margaret, Ben spent considerable time researching that property over the past few years. He believed there might be historical significance that David wouldn't appreciate or respect. Harold handed me an envelope with my name on it in Ben's handwriting. "Ben asked me to give you this privately, along with the deed to the farm. He said you'd understand what to do when you were ready." I left Harold's office feeling more confused than ever. The will reading was scheduled for the following week, and I knew it was going to be difficult, but I had no idea how cruel David would be or what Ben's cryptic message about historical significance could possibly mean. The will reading on April 15th was worse than I'd imagined. David arrived with Jessica, Harold's secretary, and Mrs. Goldberg from next door as witnesses. David was practically bouncing with anticipation, clearly expecting to inherit the bulk of our family's wealth. When Harold read the specific bequests, David's satisfaction was obvious. The house where we'd raised him, all 12 rental properties, Ben's investment accounts, everything that generated obvious, immediate value. And then Harold got to my inheritance. "To my beloved wife, Margaret, I leave the farm property in Wisconsin that belonged to my father, Samuel Goldstein, along with all contents and improvements therein. The silence that followed was deafening. David looked confused, then calculating, then dismissive. The farm? Mom gets the farm? He started laughing. Harold, what's that property actually worth? Maybe $10,000 for the land? Harold's expression was carefully neutral. The property is assessed at approximately $340,000 for tax purposes, David. It's 160 acres of potentially valuable agricultural land. But David was already moving on, clearly not concerned about my minor inheritance compared to his $2.8 million windfall. That's when he said the words that still echo in my mind. "Congratulations, Mom. Now you can live your dream of being a farmer." The laughter that followed felt like physical blows. My own son was mocking me in front of people who had known our family for decades, celebrating his good fortune by diminishing mine. "Dad must have thought you wanted to raise chickens at your age," David continued. "Maybe you can start a petting zoo for the local kids." Jessica giggled. Mrs. Goldberg looked uncomfortable. Harold stared at his papers, and I sat there, humiliated and heartbroken, holding the deed to a property I'd never wanted and a letter I was too upset to read. But David wasn't finished with his public humiliation of his mother. Over the next week, he made sure everyone in our social circle knew about the hilarious way Dad had divided the inheritance. "Can you believe it?" he told people at synagogue, at the country club, at business networking events. "Dad left Mom a broken-down farm in Wisconsin. She's going to be a farmer at 70 years old." The story got funnier each time David told it. In his version, I was a naive old woman who had somehow convinced herself that rural property was valuable. He was the sophisticated son who had inherited the real assets and would have to look after his impractical mother. But the worst part wasn't the public embarrassment. It was what happened next. 3 weeks after the will reading, David made it clear that his mockery hadn't been just temporary cruelty. It was the beginning of a systematic campaign to force me out of what he now considered his Chicago life. I was still living in the house where Ben and I had raised David, the house that now legally belonged to my son. David had been paying the utilities and property taxes from the rental income, and I'd assumed I could stay there while I figured out my next steps. I was wrong. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation," David announced when he showed up at my door on a Saturday morning with Jessica and a man I didn't recognize. "What do you mean, my living situation? This house is part of my inheritance now, and Jessica and I need to make some decisions about our property portfolio. This is Marcus Webb. He's a real estate developer who's interested in purchasing several of my buildings for a luxury renovation project." Marcus Webb was a thin, sharp-eyed man in an expensive suit who walked through my home like he was evaluating merchandise. He measured rooms, took pictures, and discussed development potential, while I stood there feeling invisible in my own kitchen. "The location is perfect for high-end condos," Webb told David and Jessica. "We could gut the interior, add a second floor, and create 2 units that would sell for over $1 million each. But we'd need vacant possession to make it work." David nodded like this was a perfectly reasonable conversation to have in front of his recently widowed mother. "Mom, here's what I'm thinking," David said after Webb left. "You should move to the farm in Wisconsin. You inherited it, so you might as well use it. Jessica and I can handle the Chicago properties more efficiently without having to worry about your living arrangements." I stared at my son in disbelief. "David, you want me to move to an abandoned farm so you can sell the house where you grew up?" "I want you to be practical, Mom. The farm is your property now. Make something of it instead of just sitting here being dependent on me for housing." "Dependent? This was my home for 30 years. Your father and I bought it together, improved it together, made it the center of our family life." Jessica stepped in with her fake, sympathetic voice. "Margaret, you have to understand that David's trying to optimize the family's financial situation. This house represents dead capital. If we can convert it to productive assets, everyone benefits in the long run. Everyone except the person who gets kicked out of her home." "You're not being kicked out," David said with exaggerated patience. "You're being given an opportunity to start fresh. The farm has potential that you're not seeing because you're stuck in old patterns of thinking. Over the next 2 weeks, David increased the pressure systematically. He stopped paying the utilities, claiming that I needed to take responsibility for my own housing costs. He brought potential buyers through the house without warning me, forcing me to leave while strangers evaluated my personal belongings along with the property. Most cruelly, he started spreading a new version of his inheritance story around our community. In this version, I was a stubborn old woman who was clinging to the past and preventing the family from moving forward. He told people that I was emotionally unstable after Ben's death and needed to be encouraged to make better decisions about my future. The whispers started immediately. At synagogue, longtime friends would ask if I was doing okay with concerned expressions that made it clear they'd heard I was having some kind of mental breakdown. At the grocery store, neighbors would give me pitying looks and ask if there was anything they could do to help. David had successfully turned my grief into evidence of incompetence and my resistance to his plans into proof of irrationality. The final humiliation came when David organized what he called a family intervention with his cousin Rachel, Harold Weinstein, and Rabbi Goldman from our synagogue. "We're all concerned about Margaret," David began, sitting in my living room like he was chairing a board meeting. "She's been making some questionable decisions since Dad died, and we think she needs support transitioning to her new circumstances." Rachel, who had always been closer to David than to me, nodded sadly. "Aunt Margaret, we know this is hard, but maybe David's right about making a fresh start. The farm could be good for you, peaceful, quiet, a chance to get away from painful memories." Rabbi Goldman was more diplomatic. "Mrs. Goldstein, no one wants to pressure you, but your son is worried about your ability to maintain this large house on your own. Perhaps we could visit the Wisconsin property together and see what possibilities exist there." Harold Weinstein said nothing during this intervention, but his expression suggested he knew more about the situation than he was saying. That night, after everyone left, I sat in my kitchen, Ben's and my kitchen, and finally opened the letter he'd left for me. "My dearest Margaret," it began in his careful handwriting. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and David has shown you exactly who he's become. I'm so sorry, my love, but it had to happen this way." The letter was 6 pages long, and every word broke my heart and opened my eyes simultaneously. "Margaret, I've been watching our son for years, hoping he would mature into a man who understood the difference between wealth and worth. Instead, he's become someone who sees our life's work as his personal entitlement, and who treats your contributions as worthless. I've structured my will to give David exactly what he thinks he wants: the obvious assets, the immediate wealth, the properties that generate clear income. But I've also given him something else: the chance to reveal his true character without the buffer of my presence to moderate his worst impulses. You, my darling, I've given the greatest treasure of all, though it won't look like treasure at first. Samuel's farm holds secrets that David could never appreciate, because he's never understood that some things are more valuable than money. In the basement of the farmhouse, behind the stone wall that looks like foundation repair, you'll find Samuel's real legacy, not just to our family, but to history itself. What's hidden there represents survival, hope, and love that transcended the worst humanity has to offer. David will try to force you out of Chicago, Margaret. He'll make you feel worthless and dependent because that's how he sees you now. But when you discover what Samuel preserved for nearly a century, you'll understand that you were never worthless. You were chosen to be the guardian of something precious that David would destroy through ignorance and greed. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about this while I was alive, but I needed David to show his true colors before the truth came out. I needed you to see him clearly, without the rose-colored glasses of parental love. The farm isn't your punishment, Margaret. It's your salvation. And when you're ready, it will give you the power to teach our son the lessons I was never able to teach him myself. I read that letter 5 times before the words really sank in. Then I packed a single suitcase, loaded Ben's old pickup truck with basic supplies, and drove to Wisconsin to discover what my father-in-law had hidden from the world for 85 years. The farm looked even worse than I'd remembered. The driveway was so overgrown, I almost missed the turnoff. The house was a wreck, broken windows, sagging roof, front porch that looked like it might collapse if you stepped on it wrong. The barn had partially fallen down, and the fields were nothing but weeds and small trees reclaiming land that had once been productive. I sat in the truck for almost an hour, crying and wondering if Ben had lost his mind during his final months. This place wasn't salvation. It was exile. David had been right to laugh at my inheritance. What could possibly be hidden in this falling-down house that would be worth anything to anyone? But I was 69 years old, with nowhere else to go, and a son who had made it clear I wasn't welcome in my own home anymore. So I got out of the truck, found the key Ben had left with Harold, and walked into Samuel's farmhouse for the first time since I was a young woman. The inside was as bad as the outside. Water damage, mouse droppings, furniture covered with decades of dust and decay. The electricity had been turned off years ago, and the plumbing probably hadn't worked since the 1980s. I spent that first night in the truck with a blanket, trying to figure out what Ben could possibly have been thinking when he planned this scenario. The next morning, I started exploring the basement, looking for the stone wall he'd mentioned in his letter. Most of the basement was typical farmhouse foundation. Fieldstone walls, dirt floor, cobwebs, and the smell of decades of dampness. But in the northeast corner, there was indeed a wall that looked different from the others. Instead of rough fieldstone, this wall was made of carefully fitted blocks that looked like they'd been added later, and when I tapped on them, they sounded hollow. It took me 3 days to figure out how Samuel's hidden entrance worked. The key was a loose stone near the floor that, when pushed in a specific sequence with 2 other stones, triggered a mechanism that swung an entire section of the wall inward on hidden hinges. Behind that wall was a room I could never have imagined. The space was about 12 feet by 20 feet, with a vaulted stone ceiling and walls lined with wooden wine racks. But these weren't just any wine racks. They were filled with hundreds of bottles, each one carefully labeled and positioned in a temperature-controlled environment that had somehow remained stable for over 80 years. In the center of the room was a heavy wooden table with ledgers, documents, and a leather-bound journal that contained Samuel's careful records of every bottle in his collection. The journal was written in English, German, and Yiddish, with dates ranging from 1920 to 1938. As I read Samuel's meticulous notes, I began to understand what I was looking at. These weren't ordinary wines. They were bottles from some of the most famous vineyards in Europe, many of them from regions that had been destroyed during World War II. Samuel had used his connections in the jewelry trade to acquire these wines during the 1930s, recognizing even then that the political situation in Europe meant this might be his only chance to preserve pieces of a world that was about to disappear. A 1921 Château d'Yquem Sauternes, a 1928 Romanée Conti Burgundy, a 1929 Château Margaux Bordeaux, bottles from vineyards that no longer existed, from vintages that had become legendary among collectors, from a world that Hitler had tried to erase completely. But the most precious discovery was a separate section of the cellar where Samuel had stored not just wine, but family treasures. Silver candlesticks that had belonged to his grandmother. A small collection of rare books in Hebrew and German. Photographs of relatives who had died in the camps. And most importantly, a detailed memoir that Samuel had written in English, documenting his escape from Germany and his dreams for the family he hoped to build in America. The memoir explained everything. Samuel had bought the Wisconsin farm in 1940 as a safe haven, a place where he could hide the most precious remnants of his old life while building a new one in Chicago. He'd spent years creating this secret cellar, installing the climate control system, and carefully preserving not just valuable wines, but the cultural heritage that the Nazis had tried to destroy. I do not know if my son Benjamin or my grandson will ever understand the value of what I have saved, Samuel had written in 1962. But I pray that someday someone in our family will appreciate that these bottles represent more than money. They represent memory. They represent survival. They represent hope that beauty can endure even when evil seems to triumph. At the bottom of the memoir was a note added in different handwriting, Ben's handwriting, dated just 6 months before his death. Dad, I found your secret, and I understand now why you never told me about it. This collection isn't just valuable, it's priceless, not because of money, but because of what it represents about our family's survival and strength. I've had several bottles appraised discreetly, and Margaret, if you're reading this, you need to know that what Samuel saved is worth more than everything I left to David combined. But more than that, it's proof that our family has always understood the difference between wealth and worth. David sees only dollar signs when he looks at success. But Samuel saw something more precious, the obligation to preserve beautiful things for future generations, even when the world seemed determined to destroy them. This is your inheritance, Margaret, not just the wine, but the lesson it represents. You were never worthless. You were chosen to be the guardian of something irreplaceable. I spent the rest of that day in the cellar, reading Samuel's memoir and trying to comprehend the magnitude of what I'd discovered. But I knew I needed professional confirmation before I could even begin to process what this meant for my future. If you've ever felt like your family didn't see your true worth, I want you to hit that like button right now. If you've ever been made to feel like you contributed nothing to the people you love most, leave me a comment sharing your story. And please subscribe to Grandma's Legacy, because every woman deserves to discover the treasures that were always inside her, even when the world tried to make her feel worthless. Over the next week, I carefully photographed every bottle, every label, every page of Samuel's documentation. Then I drove back to Chicago and contacted the most reputable wine auction house in the city. When Marcus Chen from Heritage Wine Auctions arrived at the farm and saw what was in that cellar, his reaction told me everything I needed to know. "Mrs. Goldstein," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you realize what you have here? Some of these bottles, they're museum pieces, wines from vineyards that were bombed during the war, vintages that collectors thought were lost forever." Marcus spent 3 days cataloging and appraising the collection. When he finished, he sat me down with documentation that changed my life forever. "Mrs. Goldstein, your father-in-law assembled one of the most significant private wine collections in American history. Based on recent auction results for comparable bottles, and many of these are truly incomparable, we estimate the total value at $4.2 million. $4.2 million. More than David's entire inheritance. More than Ben and I had accumulated in 50 years of building our real estate business, hidden in the basement of a worthless farm that my son had mocked me for inheriting. But David had no idea that his cruel laughter in that lawyer's office had just sealed his own fate. Because while I was discovering Samuel's treasure, David was busy destroying everything Ben had left him through the same arrogance and greed that had driven him to humiliate his own mother. While I was learning about Samuel's incredible legacy and the true value of my inheritance, David was making the biggest financial mistakes of his life. But I didn't know about his troubles yet. I was too busy figuring out how to handle a $4.2 million wine collection and the historical significance of what Samuel had preserved. Marcus Chen connected me with specialists at the Holocaust Museum in Washington who were fascinated by Samuel's memoir and the cultural artifacts he'd saved. Dr. Sarah Feldman, the museum's chief curator, drove to Wisconsin personally to examine the collection. "Mrs. Goldstein, your father-in-law created something extraordinary here," Dr. Feldman told me as she carefully photographed Samuel's documents. "These wines represent more than just valuable bottles. They're physical connections to Jewish communities that were destroyed during the Holocaust. Some of these vineyards were owned by Jewish families who didn't survive the war. The museum wanted to create an exhibit featuring Samuel's story and some of his collection. They offered to purchase 10 of the most historically significant bottles for $350,000, which would help fund the exhibit while allowing me to keep the bulk of the collection. But even more importantly, Dr. Feldman helped me understand that Samuel hadn't just saved valuable wine. He'd preserved a piece of history that needed to be shared with the world. Your father-in-law was a guardian of memory, she explained. He understood that preserving beautiful things is an act of resistance against those who try to destroy them. This collection is his victory over the forces that drove him from his homeland. For the first time since Ben's death, I felt proud instead of pitiful. I wasn't the worthless burden that David had made me feel like. I was the inheritor of an incredible legacy that connected me to generations of strength and survival. Meanwhile, David was busy proving exactly why Ben had been right to protect this treasure from his influence. I learned about David's situation when Harold Weinstein called me in early June, 3 months after the humiliating will reading. "Margaret, I think you should know that David has been making some questionable financial decisions since he inherited Ben's properties." "What kind of decisions?" "He's borrowed heavily against the rental buildings to fund what he calls high-yield investment opportunities. He's also put the properties up as collateral for some very risky development deals." Harold's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the concern underneath his professional tone. "Margaret, I think David may be in over his head financially. He's been calling me about restructuring loans and extending payment deadlines. I'm worried he may lose some of the properties." I should have felt vindicated, but mostly I felt sad. Ben had given David every opportunity to build on the foundation our family had created, and David was throwing it all away, chasing get-rich-quick schemes that reminded me of his college fantasies about overnight wealth. But I also felt something else: power. For the first time in my adult life, I had resources that nobody else controlled. I had options that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I had the freedom to make my own choices about what came next. The first choice I made was to stay quiet about my discovery while I watched David dig himself deeper into trouble. Over the summer of 2023, I lived simply in the restored farmhouse. Marcus Chen had helped me hire contractors to make the place livable while we planned the wine collection's future. I spent my days reading Samuel's memoir, learning about the wines he'd preserved, and slowly understanding the magnitude of what Ben had given me. But I also kept tabs on David through our mutual connections in Chicago. What I learned confirmed Harold's concerns and Ben's predictions about our son's character. David had borrowed $1.8 million against the rental properties to invest in cryptocurrency and startup companies. He'd joined an exclusive investment club where wealthy young professionals competed to see who could generate the highest returns through increasingly risky bets. Jessica was encouraging every bad decision, pushing David to think bigger and take the risks that Dad was too conservative to take. They'd bought a $400,000 Porsche, joined 2 more country clubs, and started throwing expensive parties to network with Chicago's financial elite. But the cryptocurrency market crashed in July. The startup companies David had invested in began failing one by one, and the loans he'd taken against Ben's carefully maintained properties started coming due with interest rates that reflected their risky nature. By August, David was scrambling to make minimum payments on debts that had grown beyond his ability to service. The rental income from the buildings, income that Ben and I had used to live comfortably for decades, was being eaten up by loan payments and David's lifestyle expenses. That's when David did something that proved Ben's assessment of his character was completely accurate. He started pressuring our elderly tenants to move out so he could raise rents dramatically. Mrs. Chen, who had lived in one of our buildings for 15 years, called me in tears. "Mrs. Goldstein, your son says I have to pay $2,800 a month instead of buying $400 or move out by September 1st. I'm on a fixed income. I can't afford that much rent. Where am I supposed to go?" Similar calls came from the Kowalski family, from Mr. Rodriguez, from young couples with children who had been stable tenants for years. David was trying to solve his financial problems by destroying the lives of people who had trusted our family to provide affordable housing. It was exactly the kind of ruthless behavior that Samuel had fled Europe to escape. Exactly the kind of heartless greed that Ben had spent his life working against. That's when I decided it was time to act. I called Harold Weinstein and asked him to meet me at the farm. When he saw the wine cellar and understood what I'd inherited, his expression shifted from confusion to amazement to something that looked like satisfaction. "Margaret, Ben was more clever than I realized. He knew exactly what he was doing when he left you this property. Harold, I want to help our tenants, but I also want to teach David a lesson he'll never forget. Can you help me do both?" Harold smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since Ben's funeral. "Margaret, I think it's time your son learned what happens when you underestimate a woman who's been underestimated her entire life." The plan we developed was simple but effective. I would use my newfound wealth to outbid David at every turn while offering his tenants the security and respect they deserved. First, I contacted each family that David was trying to evict and offered them new lease agreements at their current rents, guaranteed for 5 years. But they'd be leasing from me, not from David, in properties I was about to acquire. Then, Harold and I waited for David's financial situation to deteriorate to the point where he'd be forced to sell. We didn't have to wait long. By October, David's creditors were demanding payments he couldn't make. The investment club had kicked him out for defaulting on commitments. Jessica was asking pointed questions about their financial future and spending more time with her successful friends than with her increasingly desperate husband. When David's properties went to foreclosure auction in November 2023, I was the highest bidder on every single building. I paid $2. $4 million cash for rental properties that had been in our family for decades. Properties that David had lost through his own greed and poor judgment. But I wasn't finished with my son yet. The look on David's face when he realized I was the highest bidder at his foreclosure auction was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Confusion, then recognition, then absolute shock, as he understood that his worthless mother had just outbid professional investors to buy back every property he'd lost. "Mom, what are you doing here? Where did you get that kind of money?" I looked at my son, this man who had humiliated me in front of our entire community, who had kicked me out of my own home, who had tried to make me feel worthless and dependent, and I felt a calmness that surprised me. "Hello, David. I heard you were having some financial difficulties." The auctioneer was still processing the paperwork, but David pulled me aside with desperation in his voice. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening here. You can't possibly have $2.5 million cash. Did you borrow against the farm? Because if you did, you just made a terrible mistake. These properties are loaded with debt. Actually, David, I bought these properties free and clear. No debt, no liens, no obligations except to the tenants you were trying to evict." David's face went white. "That's impossible. You inherited a worthless farm. You've been living like a pauper for months." "Worthless?" I smiled. "David, you should be more careful about making assumptions, especially about things you don't understand." Over the next hour, as Harold and I completed the purchase paperwork, David's panic increased exponentially. He kept asking me questions I wasn't ready to answer, making increasingly desperate offers to partner with me on managing the properties, suggesting that we could work together to rebuild the family business. But the most telling moment came when Jessica arrived at the auction house after David called her with the news. "Margaret, we need to talk," Jessica said in her fakest sympathetic voice. "David's been under a lot of stress, and I think there may have been some misunderstandings about your financial situation. If you've made some kind of mistake here, we can help you fix it before it gets worse." I looked at this woman who had encouraged every cruel thing David had done to me, who had treated me like an embarrassing relative who needed to be managed rather than respected. "Jessica, the only mistake that was made was David's assumption that he could treat people badly without consequences. But don't worry, I'm sure you'll both figure out your next steps." That evening, Harold and I met with each of the tenant families that David had tried to evict. I offered them all new lease agreements at their current rents, with guarantees that I wouldn't raise their rent by more than 2% annually for the next 5 years. "Mrs. Chen cried when I handed her the new lease. "Mrs. Goldstein, you saved my home. Your son was going to force me to move in with my daughter in California, away from everything I know." Mr. Rodriguez, who had been one of Ben's first tenants 20 years earlier, shook my hand with tears in his eyes. "Your husband was a good man, Mrs. Goldstein. He would be proud of what you did today." The Kowalski family, parents with 2 young children who had been terrified about finding new housing they could afford, brought me flowers and a card their 6-year-old had made. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the worthless burden David had made me feel like, but the person Ben had always known I was, someone who cared about other people and had the strength to protect them. But David wasn't ready to accept the new reality. Over the next several weeks, he launched what can only be described as a campaign of harassment designed to force me to admit how I'd acquired the money to outbid professional investors at the auction. He showed up at the farm unannounced, demanding to search the property for evidence of whatever scheme I was running. He called Harold's office repeatedly, insisting that I must have signed documents I didn't understand or been manipulated by unscrupulous financial advisors. Most painfully, he started spreading rumors in our community that I was suffering from dementia and had been taken advantage of by criminals who were using me as a front for money laundering. "My mother hasn't been the same since Dad died," David told people at synagogue, at his former country club, anywhere people would listen. "She's making completely irrational financial decisions. We're trying to get her help, but she won't listen to reason." The whispers started again, just like they had after the will reading, but this time they had a different tone. People were curious about my newfound wealth, but they were also beginning to question David's version of events. Mrs. Goldberg, who had witnessed the original will reading, started asking pointed questions about why David had borrowed so heavily against properties that were supposed to be secure family assets. Rabbi Goldman, who had been part of David's intervention about my mental state, began wondering why a woman with dementia could outmaneuver professional real estate investors. Harold Weinstein, when pressed by community members about my competency, made it clear that I was operating with full legal capacity and complete understanding of my financial decisions. The turning point came in December, when David made the mistake of publicly challenging my mental competency during a synagogue board meeting where both of us were present. "I'm asking this community to help me protect my mother from her own poor judgment," David announced during the meeting. "She's made some very questionable financial decisions recently, and I'm concerned that she's being taken advantage of by people who don't have her best interests at heart." I had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, listening to David paint himself as a concerned son trying to protect his confused mother. But when he finished his presentation, I stood up. "David, since you're so concerned about my mental state and my financial decisions, perhaps you'd like to explain to everyone here how you managed to lose 12 profitable rental properties within 8 months of inheriting them." The room went completely silent. "Maybe you could share with the community how you borrowed $1.8 million against properties that had been debt-free for 20 years, then lost that money speculating in cryptocurrency and failed startups." David's face was red with anger and embarrassment, but I wasn't finished. "Or perhaps you'd like to explain how you tried to evict elderly tenants who had been paying rent faithfully for years, just so you could charge market rates to cover your gambling debts." Rabbi Goldman cleared his throat. "Mrs. Goldstein, perhaps this conversation would be better held privately. Rabbi, my son has spent months publicly questioning my mental capacity and spreading rumors about my financial competency. I think the community deserves to know the truth about both of our situations." I pulled out a folder that Harold had prepared for me, containing documentation of every transaction related to David's foreclosure and my purchase of the properties. David inherited $2.8 million in real estate assets from his father. Within 8 months, he had leveraged those assets so heavily that they all went to foreclosure. I purchased those same properties for $2.4 million cash, with no debt and no outside financing. The room was dead quiet as people processed this information. So the question isn't whether I'm competent to manage my financial affairs. The question is how David managed to lose in 8 months what his father and I spent 50 years building. David stormed out of that meeting, and Jessica followed him. But the damage to his reputation in our community was complete and irreversible. People began remembering David's behavior during the will reading, his public mockery of my inheritance, his attempts to force me out of my home. They began questioning whether his concern for my mental state was genuine, or whether he was trying to cover up his own financial failures. More importantly, people began treating me with the respect I'd been missing since Ben's death. They sought my opinion on community issues, asked for my advice on property investments, and generally acknowledged that a woman who could outmaneuver professional investors while protecting vulnerable tenants was probably not suffering from dementia. But the most satisfying consequence came in February 2024, almost a year after Ben's death, when David and Jessica's marriage fell apart publicly and spectacularly. Jessica had married David partly for his family's wealth and status. When that wealth disappeared and was replaced by debt, foreclosure, and community shame, she decided she'd made a poor investment in her future. The divorce was nasty, expensive, and very public. Jessica demanded alimony based on the lifestyle David had provided during their marriage, but David had no income and no assets to support those payments. She kept the Porsche, he kept the debt. By spring of 2024, David was living in a studio apartment, working as a sales associate at a friend's insurance agency, and desperately trying to rebuild both his finances and his reputation. That's when he finally came to me, not as the arrogant son who had mocked his mother's inheritance, but as a broken man who had learned the hardest lesson of his life. David knocked on my farmhouse door on a rainy Tuesday morning in May 2024, more than a year after he'd laughed at my worthless inheritance in that lawyer's office. He looked terrible, thinner than I'd ever seen him, wearing clothes that had seen better days, driving a 10-year-old Honda that was a far cry from the luxury cars he'd once owned. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I invited him into the kitchen that I'd restored with money from Samuel's wine collection. The farmhouse had been transformed over the past year, new appliances, fresh paint, modern conveniences, but with careful attention to preserving the character that Samuel had loved. It was comfortable, beautiful, and completely mine. David looked around with obvious confusion. This wasn't the decrepit shack he'd expected me to be living in. This was the home of someone with both means and good taste. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. I've always told you the truth, David. You just haven't always wanted to hear it. Where did the money come from? The money you used to buy back Dad's properties? Because it wasn't from selling the farm, and it wasn't from any inheritance I knew about." I looked at my son, this man who had caused me so much pain, who had treated me with such cruelty, who was now humbled by his own failures, and I made a decision that surprised both of us. "David, would you like to see what your great-grandfather left for our family?" I led him down to the basement and showed him Samuel's hidden cellar. When those stone walls swung open to reveal the temperature-controlled room filled with nearly 850 bottles of vintage wine, David's reaction was everything I'd expected and more. "My God," he whispered. "How is this possible? How long has this been here?" "Since 1940, David. Samuel created this place to preserve the most beautiful things he could save from a world that was trying to destroy everything he valued." I handed him Samuel's memoir and watched his face change as he read about his great-grandfather's escape from Nazi Germany, his determination to preserve cultural treasures for future generations, and his hope that his family would someday understand the difference between wealth and worth. "Mom, this collection, it must be worth millions. $4. 2 million, according to the appraisers. More than your father left you. More than Ben and I accumulated in 50 years of building our business." David sank into a chair, holding his great-grandfather's memoir with shaking hands. "I don't understand. If Dad knew about this, why didn't he tell me? Why did he let me think you inherited nothing but a worthless farm?" I sat down across from my son and spoke the truth that Ben had been too gentle to tell him directly. David, your father spent years watching you turn into someone who only cared about money and status. You treated our tenants like income sources instead of people. You were embarrassed by the work that supported your lifestyle. You saw our family's legacy as something to be converted into cash as quickly as possible. David's face reddened, but he didn't interrupt. Ben realized that if you knew about Samuel's collection, you would have pressured him to sell it immediately. You would have seen it as an asset to be liquidated, not as a piece of family history to be preserved. You would have destroyed something irreplaceable to fund your get-rich-quick schemes. And instead, he left it to you. He left it to the person he trusted to understand its real value, not just the monetary value, but what it represents about our family's strength and survival. David was quiet for a long time, reading more of Samuel's memoir and looking at the wine bottles with new eyes. Mom, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you about 1,000 apologies. David, apologies are nice, but actions matter more. The question is what you're going to do with the lessons you've learned. That conversation was the beginning of a slow, careful reconstruction of our relationship. David didn't magically become a different person overnight, but losing everything he thought mattered had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his character and priorities. Over the summer of 2024, David started visiting me regularly at the farm. Not because he needed money, I made it clear that handouts weren't part of our new relationship, but because he was genuinely interested in learning about Samuel's story and understanding the family history he'd dismissed for so long. I introduced him to Dr. Feldman from the Holocaust Museum, who had become a friend during the process of creating Samuel's exhibit. David spent hours listening to her explain the historical significance of what Samuel had preserved and the courage it had taken to save these treasures while fleeing for his life. Your great-grandfather understood something that took me 43 years to learn, David told me one afternoon, as we worked in the garden I'd planted behind the farmhouse. Some things are more important than money. By fall, David had found steady work as a property manager for a company that specialized in affordable housing. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't pay anywhere near what he'd once made in investments. But it was honest work that served a purpose he could be proud of. More importantly, he was good at it. David's experience with our family's rental properties, combined with the hard lessons he'd learned about treating tenants with respect, made him valuable to employers who needed someone who understood both the business and human sides of property management. I'm working with families who remind me of Mrs. Chen and the Kowalskis, David told me during one of our weekly dinners. People who just need a safe, affordable place to live, and landlords who won't try to exploit them. I understand now why Dad cared so much about keeping our rents fair. The biggest change in David came during the winter holidays of 2024, when he asked if he could bring someone to meet me. Her name was Sarah, and she was nothing like Jessica. Sarah worked as a nurse at a community clinic, drove a practical car, lived in a modest apartment, and was clearly attracted to David for who he was becoming, not who he used to be. Mom, Sarah doesn't care that I used to have money, David told me after that first visit. She likes me because I'm trying to rebuild my life around things that actually matter. Sarah was also Jewish, and she was fascinated by Samuel's story and the wine collection he'd preserved. She asked thoughtful questions about our family history and listened with genuine interest when I shared stories about Ben and Samuel and the lessons they'd taught me about resilience and hope. David's told me about the mistakes he made after his father died, Sarah said during one of their visits. But he's also told me about the man he's trying to become, and that's the person I fell in love with. By spring of 2025, I had made several decisions about my future and David's place in it. First, I sold a carefully selected portion of Samuel's wine collection to fund a scholarship program for young people from immigrant families who wanted to study business or real estate. The Samuel Goldstein Memorial Scholarship would ensure that future generations could build legitimate success while remembering the values that Samuel had preserved. Second, I donated 25 bottles from the collection to the Holocaust Museum for their permanent exhibit about cultural preservation during wartime. Samuel's story would be told to thousands of visitors, ensuring that his courage and foresight would inspire others. Third, I offered David a partnership in managing the Chicago rental properties I'd purchased at his foreclosure auction, not as charity, but as a business opportunity that would allow him to rebuild his financial life while serving the tenants he'd once tried to exploit. There are conditions, I told him during the conversation where I made this offer. You'll work for a fair salary, not ownership percentage, until you've proven that you understand the responsibility that comes with managing other people's homes. You'll treat every tenant with the same respect you'd want for your own mother. And you'll never, ever use these properties as collateral for investment schemes. David accepted those conditions without hesitation. Mom, I spent 30 years taking for granted everything you and Dad built. I'm not going to waste the chance to earn back your trust. By the summer of 2025, David and Sarah were engaged, and they asked if they could have their wedding celebration at the farm. I said yes, but with one request. I wanted Samuel's story to be part of their ceremony, so their future children would understand the legacy of courage and perseverance they were inheriting. Standing in the garden behind Samuel's farmhouse, watching my son marry a woman who loved him for his character rather than his bank account, I felt Ben's presence as strongly as if he were standing beside me. You did it, my love, I whispered. You saved our son, and you saved me too. The Samuel Goldstein wine collection still sits in its climate-controlled cellar, carefully preserved for future generations. But now it's not a secret. It's a source of pride and education, a reminder that survival and beauty can coexist, that some treasures are worth more than their market value. I still live in the farmhouse that David once mocked as worthless. But now it's the center of a life I built on my own terms, with resources that nobody can take away from me and relationships based on respect rather than dependence. David now manages 43 affordable housing units across Chicago, providing safe homes for families who need them while earning enough to support the modest, meaningful life he's building with Sarah. And I own 2 valuable art pieces that hang in my living room: the original deed to Samuel's farm, and a photograph from David and Sarah's wedding where 3 generations of Goldstein strength smile together in the shadow of the barn that almost fell down but didn't. Here I am, 3 years after that terrible day in the lawyer's office, sitting in my beautiful farmhouse kitchen and watching the sunrise through windows that Samuel installed with his own hands in 1943. The same sunrise that Samuel watched while he planned for a future he might not live to see, but trusted his family to build. This morning, like every morning, I had my coffee from one of Samuel's saved teacups, a delicate piece of china that survived the voyage from Germany and 80 years of hiding in a secret cellar. It tastes like history, like survival, like the sweetest victory a grandmother could ask for. David called an hour ago to tell me that Sarah is pregnant. Their first child due in December, a baby who will grow up knowing that their great-great-grandfather was a man who saved beautiful things when the world seemed determined to destroy them. Mom, we want to name him Samuel if it's a boy, David told me, his voice thick with emotion. So that part of great-grandfather's story continues. 3 years ago, I never could have imagined feeling this proud of the man my son has become. The David who laughed at my inheritance and called me worthless is gone, replaced by someone who understands that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the legacy you leave for the people who come after you. Samuel's wine collection is down to about 700 bottles now. I've sold some to fund scholarships, donated others to museums, and shared a few special bottles with family and friends during meaningful celebrations. But the collection isn't diminishing. It's fulfilling its purpose, spreading Samuel's story and supporting the values he died protecting. The most precious bottle remaining is a 1924 German Riesling that Samuel bought to celebrate his engagement to my mother-in-law, Rebecca. I'm saving that one for David and Sarah's wedding anniversary dinner next spring, when their baby will be old enough to hear the story of how their ancestors turned survival into triumph. The farm itself has become something Samuel never could have imagined. The Museum of Jewish Heritage has designated it as a historic site, and we offer tours twice a month for visitors who want to understand how ordinary people preserved extraordinary things during the darkest periods of human history. But more than a museum, it's become a home base for the kind of life I never thought I deserved. I have resources that provide security, meaningful work that connects me to our family's values, and relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. I've also become something I never expected, a source of inspiration for other women who find themselves underestimated by the people who should value them most. Last month, a woman named Patricia drove here from Milwaukee after hearing my story from a friend. Patricia's adult children had convinced her to sell the family business after her husband died, promising to invest the money professionally on her behalf. Instead, they'd lost most of her inheritance in poorly planned ventures and were now pressuring her to sell her house to cover their debts. "Mrs. Goldstein," Patricia said as we sat in my kitchen sharing tea and stories, "I feel so stupid for trusting them, but I also feel trapped. I don't have any money of my own anymore, and I don't know how to fight back." I spent 3 hours with Patricia, sharing not just my story, but the practical lessons I'd learned about protecting yourself from family members who mistake your love for weakness. By the time she left, Patricia had Harold Weinstein's phone number and a plan for reclaiming control of her financial future. "You've shown me that being a grandmother doesn't mean being helpless," Patricia told me as she prepared to drive home. "It means being the person who protects what matters most." That's what I want every woman who hears this story to understand. You are not worthless just because someone treats you like you're worthless. You are not helpless just because someone wants you to be helpless. And you are never too old to discover that you're stronger, smarter, and more valuable than anyone gave you credit for. The wine cellar that changed my life wasn't really about wine. It was about recognizing that the most precious treasures are often hidden in the places that look least promising. Sometimes those treasures are literal, like Samuel's collection of irreplaceable bottles. But more often, they're the treasures inside ourselves that we forgot we had. For 70 years, I thought my value came from what I could do for other people. I was a good wife because I supported Ben's dreams. I was a good mother because I enabled David's ambitions. I was a good person because I put everyone else's needs ahead of my own. But Samuel's legacy taught me something different. My value doesn't come from what I do for others. It comes from who I am when nobody's watching. It comes from my ability to recognize beauty worth preserving, to make difficult decisions with courage and wisdom, and to protect what matters even when protecting it costs me something. David learned this lesson too, but he had to lose everything first. He had to discover that inheriting wealth without earning wisdom is just a more expensive way to fail. He had to understand that treating people with cruelty doesn't make you powerful. It makes you small. The David who exists today would be horrified by the man he was 3 years ago. Not just because of the financial mistakes, but because of the callousness toward other people's suffering. The way he treated our tenants, the way he treated me, the way he used his temporary advantages to hurt people who trusted our family's integrity. "Mom, I wake up some mornings ashamed of how I acted," David told me recently as we walked through Samuel's restored vegetable garden. "Not just toward you, but toward everyone. I thought having money made me better than people who had less money. I thought being Ben Goldstein's son meant I was automatically worth something without having to prove my character. But shame without action is just self-pity. David has spent the last 2 years proving that he learned something from his failures. He's worked honestly, treated people fairly, and rebuilt his life around values instead of valuables. More importantly, he's become a man who understands that preserving good things requires constant effort. He tends Samuel's garden with the same patience his great-grandfather showed when he was selecting wines to hide from the Nazis. He manages our rental properties with the same attention to detail that Ben showed when he was building our family's reputation for fairness. And he's preparing to raise children who will know that their inheritance isn't just financial, it's moral. They'll grow up understanding that survival isn't just about escaping danger, but about maintaining your humanity while you're escaping. They'll learn that strength isn't about having power over others, but about using whatever power you have to protect beautiful things. Samuel's wine collection is still appreciating in value. Some bottles are now worth more than entire houses, but its real value has nothing to do with money. Its value lies in the story it tells about ordinary people who refuse to let evil destroy everything good in the world. Every time I walk down to that cellar and see those carefully labeled bottles, I think about Samuel working alone in 1940, installing climate control systems and building secret walls because he believed that future generations would need reminders of what civilization looked like before hatred tried to erase it. He was saving more than wine. He was saving hope. He was saving proof that beauty survives when people are willing to sacrifice to protect it. That's what Ben did too, when he structured his will to protect Samuel's secret from David's greed while ensuring that I would have the resources to honor our family's real legacy. Ben knew that giving David immediate access to $4.2 million in wine would have resulted in a liquidation sale within months. David would have seen only the monetary value, not the historical significance. He would have converted irreplaceable pieces of European Jewish culture into cryptocurrency investments and startup funding. But Ben also knew that I would understand the difference between treasure and wealth. He trusted me to learn Samuel's story, to preserve what needed preserving, and to share what needed sharing. Most importantly, he trusted me to teach David the lessons he couldn't teach himself while he was alive. Sometimes the people we love most need to experience real consequences before they can develop real character. The consequences David experienced were severe but not permanent. He lost money, but he found purpose. He lost status, but he gained integrity. He lost a marriage based on greed, but he found love based on shared values. And I found something I didn't even know I was missing: the confidence that comes from discovering you're capable of much more than anyone expected. If this story of hidden treasures and family redemption has touched your heart, please hit that like button right now. Each like helps other women find these important truths about their own worth and strength. Tell me in the comments what family legacy you're most proud of, or what treasures you've discovered in the most unlikely places. And please subscribe to Grandma's Legacy, because every grandmother has wisdom worth preserving and stories worth sharing. The farm that David once mocked as worthless has become the foundation for our family's future. Not because of the wine collection in the basement, but because of the lessons we learned while we were discovering it. I've learned that being underestimated is sometimes a gift because it allows you to surprise people with your strength. I've learned that real treasures are often hidden in places that look empty or broken. I've learned that survival is an active choice that requires daily decisions about what you're willing to preserve and what you're willing to sacrifice. Most importantly, I've learned that love sometimes looks like letting people face the consequences of their actions instead of rescuing them from those consequences. Ben loved David enough to let him fail completely so he could succeed authentically. Samuel loved our entire family enough to sacrifice his own comfort to preserve treasures we wouldn't appreciate until we needed them most. And I love the women who hear this story enough to tell them the truth. You are worth more than the people who undervalue you realize. You have treasures inside you that are waiting to be discovered. You have the strength to protect what matters, even when protecting it means standing alone. Sometimes the warehouse looks empty. Sometimes the farm looks worthless. Sometimes the inheritance seems like punishment instead of protection. But if you have the courage to look behind the walls that seem solid, to dig deeper than the surface that seems disappointing, to trust that the people who loved you might have seen something you couldn't see yet, you might discover that what looked like loss was actually the beginning of the most important victory of your life. Samuel's wine cellar taught me that the most precious things survive when ordinary people make extraordinary choices to protect them. Ben's final plan taught me that love sometimes works in ways we don't recognize until we're ready to receive it. And David's transformation taught me that it's never too late for people to become who they were meant to be, if they're willing to pay the price that real change requires. The sunrise through my kitchen window this morning looks exactly like the sunrise Samuel watched from this same window in 1943, when he was a refugee starting over in a new country with nothing but determination and hidden treasures. But I'm not starting over anymore. I'm continuing something that began over 80 years ago, with a man who understood that preserving beautiful things is the most important work any of us can do. Today, I'll water Samuel's garden, check on his wine collection, and continue the work of turning survival into triumph. And tomorrow, my son will bring his pregnant wife to Sunday dinner, where we'll plan for the arrival of a great-great-grandchild who will grow up knowing that their family's greatest treasure was never money. It was the wisdom to recognize what's truly worth preserving. That wisdom is my real inheritance. Everything else was just the means to discover it.